Hey everybody, it's David again. We're going to be overviewing Chapter 10 today, which is Organizational Structures and Change. The chapter starts off by giving you a real quick example, but we're going to skip that example and we're going to immediately go to the Organizational Structures and Design, which is right over here. First, it goes on to explain that an organizational structure is a system for accomplishing and connecting the activities that occur within a work organization. After that, it explains that an organizational design is the process of setting up organizational structures to address the needs of an organization, as well as account for the complexity involved in accomplishing the business objectives. Next, it moves on to the organizational change, which refers to the constant shifts that occur within an organizational system. For example, when people enter or leave the organization, market conditions shift, supply sources change, things along those lines. Lastly, it speaks on organizational development, which is the label for a field that specializes in change management. After that, it goes on to give you a few definitions of the formal organization and the informal organization, and it gives you some examples. The formal organization is an organization that's officially defined, that has a officially defined set of relationships, responsibilities, and connections that exist across the organization to help it run. And the informal organization is sometimes referred to as the invisible network of interpersonal relationships that shape how people actually connect with one another to carry out their activities. So the formal organization is run a little bit more with a little bit more structure, whereas the informal organization is run with a little bit less structure. And it goes to give you examples of the formal organization and the informal organization. Past that, it starts to speak on the types of formal organizational structures. It speaks on bureaucracy and the bureaucratic model, and it goes on to explain the 5 main elements of the bureaucratic model. The 5 main elements start off with specialization, you have command and control, you have span of control, centralization, and formalization. After these examples, it goes on to explain the difference between mechanistic and organic structures. For an example, a mechanistic bureaucratic structure is a strong hierarchical form of organizing that is designed to generate a high degree of standardization and control. In contrast to that, an organic bureaucratic structure relies on the ability of people to self-organize and make decisions without much direction, such that they can adapt quickly to changing their circumstances. After the section that we speak on organic bureaucratic structure, we move on to the next page that talks about functional structures. One example is product structure, geographic structure, and the matrix structure. The product structure exists where the business organizes its employees according to the product lines or line of business. Secondary is the geographic structure, where it exists where organizations are set up to deliver a range of products within a geographic area or region. The next example is the matrix structure. The matrix structure was designed to minimize the potential for problems, whether the problems come from the geographic structure or product structure, but the matrix structure is basically there to kind of alleviate some of the problems that come from both of those specific structures. Moving on, it starts to talk about organizational change, and it gives a little definition of that right down here. It does start to expand a little bit more on things like structural change and technological change. For an example, structural change is consistent with what we talked about so far in the chapter. Technological change, we've gone over that as well in the chapter as well. After speaking of the types of change, we're going to move on to dimensions of change, whereas there's several different categories in this topic. First, we're going to speak on the scope of change, which refers to the degree to which the required change will disrupt current patterns and routines in the business. Next, they talk about incremental change, which refers to the small refinements in current organizational practices or routines that do not challenge or change, but they do build or improve on the business model. Next, they talk about transformational change, which refers to the significant shifts in an organizational system that may cause significant disruptions to the routine or to some underlying aspect of the organization. Finally, they speak on strategic change, which is a change either incremental or transformational that helps align an organization's operations with its specific missions and objectives. Then the chapter moves on to the level of change, which refers to the breadth of systems that need to be changed within an organization. It goes on to speak of numerous other levels of changes, like individual level of change, group level change, organizational level change, as well as intentional change, planned change, and unplanned change. Proceeding in the chapter, we start speaking on managing change and how do managers deal with change. Well, change management is the process of designing and implementing change. Most leaders are responsible for some degree of change management. In addition, as indicated in the introduction, organizational development is a specialized field that focuses on how to design and manage change. Moving forward, they speak on other topics such as the deficit-based change, abundance-based change, top-down change, emergent or bottom-up approach, as well as the participatory management change. Moving on in the chapter, they speak about the Cotter's change model, which is one of the most widely used models in organizations today, and generally it aligns with a mechanistic view of structure, and thus it may be especially useful in organizations where there is strong hierarchical structure. There is an 8-step model, shown below, that relies on centralized top-down process for creating planned change. And here it goes on to give you a perfect example of the Cotter's model. Moving on, it gives a little bit more in-depth description of examples of the Cotter's model. And right here, it begins to give you an example of the Cotter's model versus a different model. It's kind of giving you contrasts and comparisons between these two models. Moving on, we start to speak about the complex adaptive system, which is basically the final model that we're going to review that builds on the assumption that all organizations are complex adaptive. Jesus. And lastly in the chapter, it goes on to speak about the Cotter's change model, which is one of the most widely used models in organizations today. Generally, this model aligns with the mechanistic view of structure, and thus it may be especially useful in organizations where there is a strong hierarchical structure. There is an 8-step model, shown below, that relies on a centralized top-down process for creating planned change. Here it goes on to give you an example of the Cotter's model, and on the next page it actually gives you a little contrast or comparison between the Cotter's model and the Lewin's model. This is kind of the end of the chapter, because after we move past here, it just gives you a few more examples of that, and then we get to the key points of the chapter. So as for Chapter 10, that is pretty much it in reference to the overview.